The first question people might ask, do you really need this kind of equipment to make espresso? Well, no, you don't. This is not the minimum what one needs. This is more like the maximum of what one needs to make the really best possible espresso you can. Anything beyond this, in my opinion, is overkill. For home use in any case, even for a small cafe, this will be fully adequate. Again, you can't make good coffee with bad beans. That's all there is to it. It just doesn't work. You can have the most expensive, you can have thousands of dollars worth of machinery, and if you use stale, pre-ground coffee, there is nothing you can do to make it taste like fresh coffee. So you need coffee beans that are fresh, but you also need coffee beans that are good. There is a lot of bad coffee made. The coffee we're talking about here is made from Arabica beans. These are the beans that are more expensive from coffee growing nations all over the world. Much of the coffee that's used in the pre-ground coffees that people drink in the US and also here in Europe is made from Robusta. Robusta is another completely different plant, and the coffee beans are very different. They contain more caffeine. You can grow a lot more of them in a small area, which is of course why they're more popular and why they're cheaper. They are considerably cheaper than the beans grown in Arabica beans. The majority of coffee nowadays, of Robusta coffee that is used in blends by large manufacturers, coffee producers, are grown in Vietnam, and they're not to be confused with the Arabica beans we'll be using here. For espresso, the blends, if you're using a blend, it is often based on Brazilian coffee. Brazilian coffee has a wonderful full body. It's good Brazilian coffee, has a wonderful full body, and it's also very forgiving in the sense that it is not acidic. One of the things one wants to avoid when making espresso is using acidic coffee beans. This is not to save your stomach. The acid in coffee doesn't bother your stomach. It's actually the oils that causes people to have difficulty drinking coffee. The acid gives the cup a very strong flavor with espresso. This is why we don't ever use Kenya coffee, African coffee from Kenya, because it tends to be very acidic. It's wonderful in the French press, it's wonderful in the little AeroPress, but for espresso we have to avoid it. So begin with fresh beans. The beans have to be ground just before use. We have a simple rule of thumb: green coffee beans, the kind that I buy to roast, will keep a year. I keep them oftentimes 2 years, and they're still fine. I keep them in jute sacks in the basement in a dry area, and they keep fine. Roasted coffee will keep 2 weeks. Many people say 10 days. I'll give it the benefit of the doubt and say 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, the coffee begins to go off. It turns stale and eventually turns rancid. So we don't want that. We want fresh coffee, coffee that has been roasted within the last 2 weeks. Try to get it, like I say, there is a great deal of argumentation about whether coffee should be stored in the freezer, in the refrigerator. I don't store coffee any longer than I absolutely have to, and I store it at room temperature. I even store it in this coffee container here in the grinder. Some purists will say, "Oh my goodness, it's going off already." Well, I don't find that to be the case, at least for my taste. So, that's the coffee in itself. Where do we go from there? Well, we go to the grinder. Well, yes, there are many grinders, and for espresso, you cannot use you cannot successfully use a blade type grinder. Blade type grinders smash the coffee beans with a fast spinning blade, as the name implies, and this is probably the most common kind of grinder that people who have a coffee grinder at all will have at home. That will not work for espresso. You need a burr grinder, a grinder that has a set of burrs that turn like this, and unfortunately the grinder is rather expensive. You can find them on eBay. There are relatively good so-called home grinders. In my opinion, it doesn't make any sense to buy one of those. It's much better to buy a used grinder, a commercial grinder, like this one. It doesn't have to be this big. The fact is, you'll get much better results with an old used grinder, a commercial grinder. You may have to replace the burrs, and that might cost you $30 more, but in any case, you'll have very good results with that. The grinder, in fact, is at least as important, and most people say more important, than the espresso machine. The grinder has to grind the coffee to a certain fineness, and it has to be adjustable so that you can adjust it. There's no way to automate this process. You have to be able to adjust the grind. On this grinder, it's by turning this ring up here to achieve certain parameters in the espresso machine that we'll talk about in a few minutes. The grinder itself, this particular one, I chose after having many. I have probably 10 grinders, all of them about this big. And I chose this one because it turns much slower than the smaller commercial grinders do. It has very large burrs, and as a consequence, the motor turns considerably slower, and it doesn't heat the coffee. I've measured the temperature of the burrs after grinding almost a kilo of coffee, and they're just barely above room temperature. Heating the coffee at this stage is not a good idea, of course. It releases the oils in the coffee much too soon in the ground state, and we don't want that. So what do we do once we've ground the coffee? Well, we put the coffee in this portafilter, is what it's called. This portafilter consists of a holder with a bayonet and the basket, as it's called. This is a 2-cup basket. This is a 2-cup portafilter. This is a 1-cup basket, and this is a 1-cup portafilter. The portafilter is the same as this, except it has this one has 2 spouts, the other has 1 spout. I'll keep this one. So we put the coffee into the portafilter, and you say, well, yes, how much coffee? This depends a little on your taste. For a double basket like this, a 2-cup basket, I use 18 grams. You can use anywhere from 14 to 20 grams if they'll fit in the basket. You have to make sure, of course, when they fit in, when you put the coffee in the basket, that it will fit here in the machine, because underneath this part here where it fits in, there is, in fact, a so-called shower screen and a brass disc that spreads the water out so that it enters the coffee in a certain manner, and the coffee cannot come up higher than that shower screen, otherwise you can't put the portafilter in here. So for this basket here, I can use, like I say, 18 grams, and you put it in here, you set it down, and you tamp. The tamper is a very important part of the equipment you need. This one is a very nice one, made here in Germany, but there are excellent tampers made in the United States. This one is my favorite because the wooden part up here is grenadilla wood, which is or grenadilla, which is the wood clarinets are made out of, and I played clarinet all my life until a few years ago, and I enjoy using this very much. This has a slightly convex surface. That's my favorite. There are flat ones, there are actually concave ones. Everyone has their own idea of what might be best. I've had good results with this one. Most important, however, is the fact that the diameter of this tamper has to match the diameter of the basket. Otherwise, you'll leave a ring around the outside if it's too small. If it's too big, it won't fit. If you leave a ring around the outside, you find that the coffee then tends to go in around the edges and doesn't really go through the center. So you want to always make sure you buy the tamper that will fit your basket. You can get these in 1/10 of a millimeter sizes. The best way, if you're uncertain, if you can't read a caliper and you don't have a digital caliper, send your basket to the tamper company and they'll fit one for you. You put the filter in here, you make sure it's very tight, and you turn the machine on and you let water run through. The water runs through because there's a pump in the machine. The pump pumps up to 9 bar of pressure, and that is the second parameter. We're going to use 18 grams of coffee in this case. We're going to press the water through at 9 bar maximum pressure. It may not be that high. And finally, the temperature of the water, as regulated in this machine, is 94 degrees, which is the temperature I prefer to have it at. You can adjust it. It can be lowered to 90. It can be raised to 96. For me, 92 to 94 is the proper temperature, and I try to stick with that. This is a so-called heat exchanger machine. That means there's a large boiler, a copper boiler. It holds over a gallon of water. It has a 2,000 watt heater in it. It heats the water to boiling and raises the pressure to 2 bar inside the boiler, inside the large boiler. Inside this boiler is also a second little container that is not under pressure, and it has an input, an inflow and an outflow, and it's the heat exchanger. That's the device that heats the water that's going to come out of the portafilter here, that is going to the coffee and come out of the portafilter. The heat exchanger sits inside of the boiler, so it theoretically also has much too high a temperature, and as a consequence, we want to, if the machine has been on a long time, we do what's called a cooling flush. That is, we let the water run through. And we can see steam here. That means the water is too hot. After 30 seconds, it will have 94 degrees. The temperature will be 94 degrees, and we'll be able to make our first cup. Cooling flush is important with a machine like this because clearly the heat exchanger will heat too hot.